I also have a number of unknowns listed down here as well. Now, as you'll notice here, the first absorbance readings for our tubes that have 0 concentration actually have an absorbance reading, and these shouldn't have an absorbance reading when we're actually drawing our standard curve. So we're going to need to go through a number of different ways in order to subtract this blank. So the first way that you could use is you could actually calculate the average of these two tubes yourself, either by a calculator or using Excel itself, and then you can actually input in the formula here with equals, because that always tells Excel that you're starting a formula, and then you want to subtract your average blank, so it will be C4 subtract 0.0515 is the average. So therefore then you press enter, and that then gives you obviously a slight absorbance reading because the average between these two is not going to give you straight 0. If you then click on the little black box at the bottom here, so you can see that the cursor changed, you can then copy this formula all the way down and actually subtracts that value from all your other tubes. You just need to make sure that you go back to these two here and you change these to 0 at the end to make sure that they are actually at 0, because we have 0 concentration with 0 absorbance. Another way that you can actually subtract the blank is if you actually input in the formula directly into Excel. So what you can actually do, again, you'll start with the equals sign, and the cell that we want to subtract it from is this one over here, C4. So we input in C4, and then we want to subtract our average, and we can actually set it up for Excel to calculate the average and subtract it at the same time. The big thing to note with Excel is if you don't want the cells themselves to change, so the number C4 here to change, you need to put a $ in both in front of the letter and also in front of the number. So what we would need to do is do $C, $4 for the first well, and then because we're calculating the average, we also want to add in the second blank tube, so it's going to be $C and then $5 this time, and you can see that the Excel actually highlights the two different cells that we're actually calculating this average from. We then need to close our brackets, so we're now actually saying these are the two that are together, and obviously divide by 2. So therefore then we're adding these two together and dividing those by 2, and each of our cells is going to subtract this number. So if we press enter, we get our value here, and again if we copy that all the way down, we actually get, as you can see, the same absorbance readings as we originally got. So if you actually click through here on these individual cells, you can see the number up here that it's changed as we've copied it down. So C6, 7, 8, all the way down. Whereas in this one here, while the first number will change, the C6 changes to C7, the other numbers for the averages, because we've got these $ present, they don't change as we've copied this formula down. So it means then that we can actually maintain the same average along the whole way. Again, you'll still need to go back and change these two both to 0. So now that you actually have your concentration readings are correct and you've subtracted your blank from all your absorbance readings, you're ready to start drawing your graph. So what you need to do is highlight the actual the cells here, hold down your control key, and then you also will highlight the absorbance readings as well. Then you'll need to go up here to insert, and we always make sure that we insert an XY scatter graph when we're talking about scientific graphs. We don't want to import in a line graph, it's always an XY scatter, and you always want it just to be the points. You can always add the lines in later. So we'll click on it here and we have our graph. As I personally prefer to always make the graph larger because it makes things easier when you're actually adding in your lines of best fit and also reading off your controls. As we only have one set of data, we don't need to keep the legend, so we can delete that off. The next thing we need to do is we need to make sure we add in our grid lines. So we go here to the option Layout Grid Lines, we add in our major and minor grid lines for the horizontal, and we also need to do the same thing for our minor grid lines. Now for those of you that are working on Macs, your functionality at the top here will be a little bit different, but there are still options that you can add in your grid lines. You'll just need to add in both the major and minor independently of each other. The next thing we need to do is label our axes. So we go to horizontal axis and we put the title below the axis, and this one here, because it's our concentration and it happens to be concentration of protein, so it's going to be concentration of protein, and in this particular case it's actually in micrograms per mil. So always make sure when you're labeling your x-axis, you tell us what the concentration is of, whether it be a protein or specifically a sugar, reducing sugar, or a particular protein. In the case of the first years, you guys would be writing concentration of albumin. And then you also need to always make sure you include the units as well. And then you can press enter and you can see that the title is added down the bottom here. We also will need to label the axes of our vertical axis. I personally prefer a rotated title, so I will always add this one in. And in this case here, it's our absorbance. And we also need to make sure we include always the wavelength that that absorbance has been read at. In this case, it's 690 nanometers. Last part of labeling that we need to add is our chart title. Now, as I've mentioned a few times, Excel always puts the title at the top of the graph here. So we can still add in all of our information and then we can move it once we're actually finished labeling it. So in this case here, we have figure 1, standard curve for Lowry assay using BSA as a standard. Now, you guys can use whatever title you would like. You just need to make sure that it includes the assay that you're actually completing and potentially some information about what you're trying to measure off that standard curve. So whether it be that you discuss what actual protein you've used as the standard, or you actually discuss what the unknown is itself that you're trying to determine. So you can see here we have quite a large title added to the top here. So what I will always do is go here to home and I will shrink the size of our font here, maybe a little bit smaller again, and then you can actually, if you get the cursor to have the 4-way arrows here, you can actually pick up your title and move it down to the bottom. You can then do the same thing for your graph. You can actually highlight your graph and then move the entire graph up, which now means that you can move your title to wherever you'd like to have it, whether you wanted to have it centered or whether you want to have it over onto the side here. You can also obviously change it to not be bolded as well. It's up to you as to how you would like to have that title actually completed. So now we have our graph, we've actually labelled all of our axes and we've got our figure title nice and neatly done. Next thing to do is to actually draw our line of best fit. And just before we do that, actually, what we also want to make sure is all of our marker sizes here are quite commonly in Excel, they're usually quite large. So if you click on the data series here, and then for PC users, right click. We want to go to Format Data Series, go to Marker Options, and then go here to Built-in, and we want to make the marker size smaller. In most cases, you can probably drop the size down to 5, but depending on the actual shape, so some of these shapes here tend to be bigger than others, you may need to actually drop this size down to 3 or 4, because we want to make sure that our markers are always clear to see, but not so large that they actually take up a lot of space. So it actually means that our line of best fit will not be very accurate. So now that we have our markers are smaller, what we can actually do is go here to Layout, Shapes, and now we're going to add in a line. So what we actually will do is, if you line up your cursor right here on the 0, you can see that my cross hairs here are exactly on the 0 point. You hold down your mouse button and then you can draw your line of best fit up. And you can alter this line of best fit to wherever it needs to go. You just need to make sure that you have as many points above the line as you have under the line. And preferably, if you can, you even have points that are all touching the line. But obviously this data is not going to show that. And then you've got your line of best fit in here. Now, a lot of students like to add in a trend line. This can be useful if your data points are good, but they're not always going to be perfect. So if you actually highlight your data points, again right click and add trend line. The biggest things to note with the trend line is you always want to set your intercept here at 0. There's no need to display the equation on the chart or anything, because you're going to manually read off all of your results. So you can have a look here with the trend line. The trend line itself that Excel has drawn, I don't think is very good, because it's actually got too many points above the line and not very many under the line. So I'm going to delete the trend, whoops, don't want to delete the whole thing. I'm going to delete just the trend line itself, and keep my line that I've drawn in myself. The next thing you need to do is you will need to read off your unknown samples off your graph. Now, you can either print off this graph yourself and draw the lines in later, or you can actually add them in now. So if you go here to shapes, again select a line. So our first unknown here is at 0.0865. So what we need to do is find 0.0865. So obviously in the middle is going to be 0.9, so a little bit below that will be here. And then you can draw your line across. Now, a little cheat is if you actually hold down the shift button, it actually makes sure that your line as you're going across will remain straight, as opposed to you trying to make sure that it's straight yourself. So you just hold down shift as you're drawing your line and you'll get a nice straight line. You then will also obviously need to connect this line up and draw your line going down. Again, you can hold the shift button, which then means that you get your nice straight line coming straight back down again. Now if you have a colour printer at home, by all means you can change the colour of this line here to whatever colour you like, to actually then be able to differentiate between the different line unknowns that you're adding. So our second one here is at 0.9. So we go again into here, we find 0.9, draw a line across. Remember, hold down our shift button so we get our nice straight line. And then we're going to connect it back up to go down as well. Alright, so there's two of our unknowns drawn on our graph. The other thing you need to do, remember, is you always want to label these unknowns. So if we actually go here to a text box, we can add in here a little text box above our line, and we can add in here tube 13. Oops. And then you can also, obviously, you can make your text box smaller, so it doesn't have to be as large as this. Just make sure that it's still always big enough to actually have all the data on it. You can also actually shrink the size of the text if you'd like, and make sure that it's sitting in the into the actual position that you would like. So you can always move this text box to a position that actually sits better on top of the line. So you can add in a text box for each of your different unknowns that are actually on here. So this is the basics of how to draw your graph. Obviously you can then click on here, print it as an individual page, so you can just go File, Print, and it will actually print your graph on a large page, and you can see that it's full-size page. The other option is you can actually also copy this graph, move it into a Word document, and you can actually then add it to the end of your report as part of the Word file as well. I hope this video has been useful for people. If you have any questions, please let me know.